Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on spinal nerves and plexi and a little bit of dermatomes at the end. So let's dive into it. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves or mixed nerves. When we think spinal nerves, I want you to think mixed nerves because they carry sensory and motor information. Our cervical nerves correspond to the cervical vertebrae, thoracic correspond to the thoracic, lumbar to lumbar, then we have our sacral, and then at the very end we have a sacral. So we have are 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And capital C, lowercase o is the abbreviation we typically use for coccygeal, just so we don't get it mixed up with the capital C abbreviation for cervical. And as we're looking at these spinal nerves, it's worth emphasizing that the very first cervical nerve, C1 cervical nerve, is going to exit way, way up here between the skull and the atlas. Remember, the atlas is the very first cervical vertebrae, C1. All of the other cervical nerves are going to exit through the intervertebral foramina that are present. So here we have our overview of all of those spinal nerves. All right, clear the screen and next. Excuse me. So as we look at our spinal nerves, we have some proximal branches. And those proximal branches are going to be the branches that are close to the point of attachment. Remember, when we think of proximal and distal in terms of directional terminology, proximal means close to the point of attachment or point of origin, and then distal means far from the point of attachment or far from the point of origin. So as we look at this posterior root, which is over here, that posterior root carries sensory information in. We have the posterior root ganglion that helps to do a small amount of pre-processing. We have our anterior root right over here that carries motor information out. And as we look at all of these roots, we have the cauda equina. I talked about that several videos ago. It's in chapter 13 material. The cauda equina, or horse's tail, is going to be a whole bunch of nerve roots within the vertebral column, typically the lower 1/3 of the vertebral column, originating at the second lumbar vertebrae and terminating at the coccyx. As we're looking at these spinal nerves, the distal branches of the spinal nerve are going to be beyond the vertebrae. So the proximal branches are inside of the vertebrae. Distal branches are outside of the vertebral column or outside of the vertebrae. And as we're looking at this, first let's dive in and look at the anterior ramus. Now, as we're looking at the anterior ramus, this anterior ramus is going to be located within the thoracic region, and it gives rise to the intercostal nerve. So as we look down here on our diagram, we have the posterior ramus of the spinal nerve right here, this branch. We have the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve. So as we look at the anterior ramus, it's going to give rise to our intercostal nerve and keep traveling to make the intercostal nerve. Here we have the posterior ramus. That posterior ramus, which, let me clear the screen here. Let's go blue for posterior ramus and green, excuse me, apparently I'm colorblind. Let's go blue for the posterior ramus and green for the anterior ramus, just to help keep our head straight here. So we have our anterior ramus in green right here. That's going to head to the ribs and form the intercostal nerves. We have the posterior ramus right here. That posterior ramus is going to innervate, or when we think of innervate, this is a word that means to send and receive nervous signal, or send and receive electrical signals. So it's going to innervate muscles and joints of the spine and skin of the back. And then let's shift colors to bright red. We have the meningeal branch. This meningeal branch re-enters into the spinal column or vertebral column, and it's going to innervate the meninges, vertebrae, and spinal ligaments. So as we look at that meningeal branch, the meningeal branch is responsible for allowing us to have some sensation of pain within our back. So this is one of the reasons why when somebody gets a spinal tap, it hurts so much, because they have that meningeal branch that goes back and innervates those meninges so that they can have a sensation of pain and sensory information from those meninges. So as we're looking at the nerve plexi, when we think of a plexus, I want you to think of it as a, for lack of a better term, a spider web. Or you could think of it as a bunch of branching nerves. And these nerve plexi allow for us to have some slight redundancies, not 100% redundancies, but slight redundancies within our peripheral nervous system, so that if one of the small branches gets cut, there's still an alternative pathway that we can reroute some of, not all of, the information around. So as we look at the plexi, that anterior rami branch, anastomoses repeatedly. And when we think of an anastomose, that is going to be a word that we haven't talked about yet. When we think of an anastomoses, I want you to think of forming a alternative path. So if we have point A to point B, we can go in a straight line, or we could have alternative pathways. We could have anastomoses connecting point A to point B. So that's what this term anastomoses means. It's a branching that gives you an alternative way to connect one area to another area. So as we're looking at these anterior rami, they anastomoses repeatedly, and they form these nerve plexi, or these spider web-like, or not, these web-like structures, or net-like structures of nerves. The cervical plexus is up here, and I just circled it in blue, and it's going to be located within the neck, and it's going to originate from C1 to C5, first cervical vertebrae to fifth cervical vertebrae. The cervical plexus is unique in that, let me clear the screen here, it's getting a little crowded for me. It supplies the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is a very important nerve. It is the nerve that allows us to control our diaphragm, the muscle we use to inhale air into our lungs. So what does this mean? This means that somebody can have a spinal cord injury at C5 or lower down, maybe L2, or excuse me, T2 or maybe L2. They can have spinal cord injuries through most of the vertebral column, but because the phrenic nerve originates way up here at the cervical plexus, we can still breathe in and breathe out even if we have a spinal cord injury higher up in our vertebral column. As we look at our brachial plexus, brachial is a word that refers to upper arm. The brachial plexus is going to originate from C5 and terminate at T1. So our brachial plexus originates right here. And as we look at this brachial plexus, I want you to think of it as the branching web-like structure that controls or helps to innervate the upper limb of the shoulder and some of our neck. So this brachial plexus right here is distinct from the cervical plexus in that there's different points of origin. In cadaver studies, I personally struggled with them because they overlap with each other. From the brachial plexus, the key nerve I want to emphasize is the medial nerve. Clinically speaking, the medial nerve is significant because that medial nerve, which is right here in the middle, that median nerve is going to carry information, sensory information from the carpal region. And if somebody is suffering from carpal tunnel syndrome, that's the key nerve that will transmit those pain signals. As we're looking at the lumbar plexus, our lumbar plexus is going to originate at L1 to L4, so the lumbar vertebrae, hence the namesake lumbar plexus. Here is a view of the lumbar plexus. And that lumbar plexus is going to supply innervation to the abdominal wall, so the anterior of our abdomen, anterior of our thigh, and the genitalia as well. As we look at the sacral plexus, it originates from the sacrum itself. Key nerves that I want to emphasize from the sacral plexus include the sciatic nerve, which I think is very unique, very interesting, because our sciatic nerve is, as a rule of thumb, this is a pun intended, as a rule of thumb, the sciatic nerve is about the size of the thumb of the individual. And it just amazed me during cadaver studies how big that nerve was. In terms of a key nerve that I should emphasize from the lumbar plexus, that key nerve that I want to emphasize is the femoral nerve coming from that lumbar plexus. Now, farther down, I'm going to shift to blue here. We have the coccygeal plexus. The coccygeal plexus originates at S4, S5, and at the coccyx itself. And the coccygeal plexus is very tiny. It's going to be located right down there. And it's pretty difficult to find in most diagrams. The diagram we have in lab, or the model we have in lab, we call the Mortimer nervous relief model. And it's not a perfect model, but it's the best one that we got. We get a lot of bang for our buck with that teaching model. It's the next best thing compared to a cadaver study. And let's transition. As we're looking at our nerve plexi, they carry a lot of somatosensory information from bones, muscles, joints, and skins. And a key one is proprioception. And when we think of proprioception, this is a way for you to know how your body is oriented, the positioning of your body in space, even if you can't see your body. Generally speaking, if you have lots of proprioception, you are very coordinated. If you have poor proprioception, you have poor coordination. So this is part of, for example, a field sobriety test that a police officer may give to somebody they suspect of driving while impaired. And you close your eyes and you have to touch your index finger to your nose. And the funny thing is, I'm sitting in my garage by myself making this recording, and I just closed my eyes and did that. And I actually did hit my nose. Yes, I do have some. I'm not drunk, I promise. And as we're looking at this proprioception, it's all about spatial awareness. So generally speaking, very talented athletes, particularly gymnasts or collegiate wrestlers, collegiate gymnasts, they're going to have phenomenal proprioception. People that tend to be tripping all over themselves, they're going to have poor proprioception. As we look at motor function, the motor functions of these nerve plexi are to send action potentials to skeletal muscles and stimulate contractions. That's relatively straightforward. Not much explanation is needed there. And then finally, we have the dermatome. A dermatome is an area of skin or a band of superficial skin or a superficial band on our body that's going to carry sensory input for a specific spinal nerve. As we're looking at these dermatomes, we can see the dermatome map over here. So for instance, as we're looking at this figure, T4, the spinal nerve associated with T4 is going to carry sensory information from this horizontal band across the chest that includes the male's nipples. As we look at the genitalia here, genitalia are going to be from the S2, S3 dermatomes. So it's a way for you to pinpoint where an injury may have occurred. Clinically speaking, dermatomes and dermatome maps are useful in pinpointing exactly where on the body a spinal cord injury may have occurred. So if the individual had a spinal cord injury or tore their spinal cord between C5 and T1, they would have some innervation of their upper torso, but they would not have innervation, or they wouldn't have sensory perception anywhere else farther down in their body. Some of the more interesting ones include if they can feel the anterior of their knee, but they can't feel the posterior of their lower leg. That implies that there was a spinal cord injury between L5 and S1. These dermatomes are also clinically significant because they dictate the spread of shingles. So when you have a band of irritated rash like blisters traveling down the body, it's because the virus responsible for causing shingles is traveling along the spinal nerve to cause that irritation. Now, this map makes it look like the dermatomes are very cut and dry, but it's worth emphasizing that there's a lot of overlap between the dermatomes, up to 50%. So generally speaking, if you want to anesthetize a specific area, let's say you really wanted the patient's belly button to go numb, you typically are going to have to go above and below and anesthetize that whole area just to play it safe. Now, that's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.